Hello students, and welcome to session 4 of Multicultural Ministry. This week we are looking at various forms of cultural conversion, how cultures come together, and rather than using the term clash, we'll use the term converge. How do they come together and blend? But I start this week introducing you to a theologian, a Japanese theologian by the name of Kosuke Koyama. He was born in 1929 and grew up as a young teen during World War II. But prior to the war, he was discipled by a missionary, an American missionary, and he became fascinated with Christianity. So after the war, he came to America and pursued a theological degree in America. And it wasn't long after that, after receiving his education, that he rejected his own religious and cultural backgrounds as worthless. He didn't see much of a need to be Japanese or to express some of his cultural ideas as being relevant in an American theological system. What Kosuke Koyama brought to the table was this idea that that theology and many times the way we approach theology in America has its origins in place in Western society. It's shaped by Western society, and so we think in Western categories, and we reject other cultural expressions. So later, as a missionary to Thailand, Kosuke Koyama realized that he couldn't communicate these Western ideas in the language uh, and and the cultural concepts of the Buddhist mind. So he had to think of another way of theologizing that took context or place into consideration. And after a series of several cultural misunderstandings back here in the United States, it made him feel like an outcast. In fact, he called himself a theological orphan. He felt ostracized and rejected. And you'll see the story of his life at the very beginning of our lesson this week. In fact, one of the things I described is the day he showed up to his classroom and he saw his name written on the board, Kosuke Koyama, in English, and he crossed it out, wrote his name in Japanese, and said, "This is who I am." So he had a growing sense for the need of cultural and theological legitimacy that is based on context and culture. So he began to challenge American theologians to begin to think outside of the Western frames of thinking for theology. Systematic theology is Eurocentric, but theology emerges in other places, in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia. In other places, they have different ways of thinking about theology, and so he was very instrumental in helping us to think beyond our Western ways of thinking. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how Koyama's experiences and reflections relate to multicultural ministry. So I asked a few questions. In what ways, if any, are contextual differences in theology identical to contextual differences in cultural orientation? In other words, the things that he discovered, are they true and relatable to some of the cultural challenges we face in churches? Another question I ask is, do we take for granted that our pattern of ministry, um, are they appropriate or relatable to those to whom we minister? So if we are relating to the people that we minister to from a Western frame, are those frames relatable? Should we consider the culture of origin for those to whom we minister? And what can we learn from those at the margins to whom we minister? What do they have to teach us? To assume that our way of theologizing is always correct would be a wrong assumption. We can learn from those at the margins. And so I invite you to think about those things as we move on. The core of our lesson for this week, however, is cultural blending. How do cultures converge? How do they come together? So we revisit those four aspects of convergence that we've talked about early in the class. And those four are assimilation. Sometimes cultures, perhaps a less, or we would call it a marginal culture or a minority culture, will enter into a place where it is dominated by the majority culture, and the majority culture absorbs the other culture into their ways and practices of life. So assimilation is where culture is absorbed into the dominant culture, and they begin to look like, act like, dress like, and all of their forms of church life, religious faith, everything is it is changed or transformed from what it used to be into the ways and the practices of the dominant culture. That would be assimilation. Primordialism is different. Primordialism assumes that people are inescapably tribal, or that every culture, you just can't get away from your place of origin. If you are from a particular area, the patterns of life will emerge automatically. It's almost like a biological reality for those who are culturally immersed in their particular culture. So for primordialism, I'll give you an example. If you are, let's say, a Japanese, and you enter into a Western civilization, uh, your Eastern ways of thinking, or, from whatever country it may be, never goes away, and it is required for you to, for the comfort of your ability to cope with others, to have those Eastern practices and those ways. Now, that may not necessarily be true. This is what I want you to consider and to think about, and how churches sometimes, monocultural churches, believe that their way of doing things will really dominate the conversation. So primordialism is another thing that we will consider. Circumstantialism is another point of view in convergence. It's the idea that identity, of a cultural identity, is changed depending on the need to change it. In other words, if I were African American and I needed to become more Hispanic for a better outcome, a job, I'm able to change my cultural identity based on the circumstances that surround me. So circumstantialism, it assumes that identity can be transferred or changed based on practical reasons. A child that is an orphan that grows up in a foster care from a different culture may choose later in life to identify as that other culture, and escape his own or her own culture to embrace the other culture because it fits their understanding or their worldview better. So circumstantialism is the idea of being able to transfer your cultural biases because circumstances allow you. And then neoculturation is the final aspect of cultural blending, and that is the making of a new cultural reality, or what we called earlier interculturalism. So I ask you in the lesson, do you see these forms of blending happening in your church or in your city? What do you see is the dominant form of blending when various cultures merge together? The last thing I do in this week is talk about building a multicultural church, and I give you kind of a checklist of a series of things to think about. It's a list of some things churches can do to ensure greater interculturality, and so that's the end of the lesson. And so this week I'm hoping that you would read Branson and Martinez, pages 97 to 188.